Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that's, well, it's universal, but you'd be surprised how many people misunderstand it, even those who experience it firsthand. We're talking about menstruation.
It's true. It's really a shame how much misinformation is out there.
And you sent me a ton of research on it, articles, studies, a real treasure trove. So I'm excited to really get into the science of periods and the cultural baggage that comes with them.
It's definitely a fascinating area of study, and you're right, there are so many different angles to explore. For instance, did you know there are all these intricate processes happening behind the scenes that we're still just beginning to understand? And from an evolutionary standpoint, there are still mysteries surrounding menstruation.
See, I love that. It's like it's such a fundamental part of being human, but there's still so much we don't know. And to kick things off, I think a good place to start is by busting a common myth.
Mm.
That whole periods last a week thing.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the biggest misconceptions out there. In reality, menstruation is a whole month-long cycle, not just a 7-day ordeal.
Exactly. So walk me through it. What's actually going on in there?
Well, the really remarkable thing is that it's not just one cycle, but two processes that are happening in sync. You've got the menstrual cycle, which preps the uterus, and then you've got the ovarian cycle, which is all about readying the egg for possible fertilization.
Whoa, it's like two dance partners perfectly in step with each other.
Precisely. And just like a dance, hormones play a crucial role. Think of estrogen, especially estradiol, as the conductor of this whole orchestra. Right after your period, estradiol swoops in and basically tells the uterine lining to thicken up. And it even adjusts the acidity in the uterus, to make it more welcoming for sperm.
Like laying out the welcome mat. I like it.
Exactly. And while this is happening in the uterus, over in the ovaries, it's like a competition is going on.
Oh.
You have all these follicles that contain eggs, and they're all maturing, but only one will be, well, chosen.
Okay, so the uterus is prepped. We have an egg ready to go. What's next in this intricate dance?
Well, if you picture the uterus like a luxury hotel suite, this next stage is all about going above and beyond to make it as inviting as possible. And this is what we call the secretory phase, where you get this increase in blood flow to the uterus, bringing in a surge of nutrients to create the perfect environment for, well, for a fertilized egg, of course.
Wow, no detail is spared. It really goes all out, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a go big or go home situation because if an egg gets fertilized, that lining needs to be ready to support a whole other human being.
That is mind-blowing when you really think about it. But what happens to the egg if it doesn't, meet its match?
This is where it gets even more interesting. So the follicle that released the egg, it doesn't just disappear. It transforms into something we call the corpus luteum, and this starts churning out progesterone.
Okay, so what does progesterone do?
Well, if estrogen is all about prepping that uterine lining, progesterone is like the caretaker. It's responsible for maintaining that plush, nutrient-rich environment we talked about, just in case fertilization happens.
So it's like keeping the lights on just in case, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. If no fertilized egg shows up, the corpus luteum's like, all right, party's over, and it stops producing progesterone.
And I'm guessing that's where things start to go south for a lot of us, right?
Exactly. That sudden drop in both estrogen and progesterone, well, it can wreak havoc on our systems, and for many, it triggers those all too familiar PMS symptoms.
Oh, I know those symptoms all too well. The mood swings, the irritability. It's like our bodies are throwing a mini tantrum.
In a way, they are. These fluctuating hormone levels, especially that drop in progesterone, they directly impact our brain chemistry. You see, there are these neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine that play a huge role in regulating our mood, and they're very sensitive to these hormonal shifts.
So it's not just in our heads then. There's a real biological basis for all the emotional ups and downs.
Absolutely. And speaking of fascinating biological processes, here's a fun fact. Did you know that humans are actually part of a very select group of mammals that actually menstruate?
Wait, seriously? I always thought all mammals got periods.
It's a common misconception. You see, most mammals experience something we call an estrus cycle, which is more commonly known as going into heat.
Oh, okay. So like when cats start meowing incessantly and dogs are, well, extra doggy.
Exactly. It's all about signaling their fertility and readiness to mate. And what's interesting is that if they don't get pregnant during that estrus cycle, their bodies reabsorb the uterine lining.
Huh. So they don't shed it like we do. So why do our bodies go through the effort of shedding the lining?
That's a question that has baffled scientists for ages. We still don't have a definitive answer, but there are a couple of theories floating around. One thought is that it might be related to the structure of the human endometrium, which is the uterine lining. Ours is much thicker and has more blood vessels compared to other mammals, so shedding it might just be more efficient than reabsorbing it. And another theory suggests it could have something to do with, well, with the way humans carry their young. We have placentas, which are unique to placental mammals, and some scientists believe that the process of menstruation might be somehow connected to that, but honestly, the definitive answer is still a bit of mystery.
A biological cliffhanger. I love it. But before we get totally lost in the science of it all, I'm really itching to unpack some of the cultural baggage that surrounds periods. You know, all the myths, the taboos. Are you ready for a little myth busting?
Oh, I'm always up for a good myth-busting session. Bring it on.
All right, let's dive right into it. Let's talk about, well, you know that whole thing about periods syncing up, like when you live with someone or you're close friends and suddenly you're both on the same cycle?
Oh.
Myth or reality?
Oh, that's a classic. And it's one of those things that people swear is true, right?
Yeah, like you hear all these anecdotal stories and it just makes you wonder, you know?
I know. It's so tempting to believe. And there was actually this study back in the 70s that kind of fueled the fire, but it's since been, well, pretty thoroughly debunked.
So no scientific basis for it then?
Not really. While lots of women report experiencing this sinking phenomenon, larger studies haven't been able to find any hard evidence to back it up.
So our brains are just playing tricks on us, trying to find patterns where there aren't any.
Basically. Our brains love to find patterns. It's how we make sense of the world, but sometimes it means connecting dots that aren't really there.
That makes sense. Our brains can be funny that way. All right, ready for another myth to be busted?
Hit me with it.
Okay, this one I've heard a lot, and it always makes me cringe a little. Is it true, or is it just an old wives' tale, that you can't get pregnant on your period?
Oh man, that's definitely one myth we need to debunk right now. Because unfortunately, it's just not true. It might seem counterintuitive, but you absolutely can get pregnant on your period.
Really? But how? I mean, I thought that was, like, biologically impossible.
It's easy to assume that, but remember how we were talking about cycles overlapping? Well, sperm are surprisingly resilient little things. They can actually survive inside the female reproductive tract for up to 5 days.
5
Oh.
days. Seriously.
Yep. So imagine this. Ovulation happens shortly after your period ends, and there is still some sperm hanging around from earlier in the month. It's a recipe for, well, for getting pregnant.
Wow, I had no idea it was that long.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a good reminder that, protection is important throughout your entire cycle, not just at certain times.
Exactly. Better safe than sorry, always.
Okay, so speaking of things that can be, well, a little scary during certain times of the month, let's talk about an age-old fear, especially for someone who loves the ocean. Sharks. Is there any truth to that whole thing about sharks being attracted to menstrual blood?
The shark myth. It's definitely a popular one, and I totally get why people are curious or terrified.
Right, like every time I'm in the water, that thought pops into my head.
I hear you. But I have good news on that front. Sharks are not actually attracted to menstrual blood.
Really?
They have an incredibly powerful sense of smell, but they're not particularly interested in us as a food source, period or no period.
Okay, that's a huge relief. But what about bears? They've got a keen sense of smell too, don't they?
They do, and it's always smart to be cautious around any wild animal, but studies have actually shown that grizzly and black bears, for the most part, aren't particularly interested in menstrual blood either.
Okay, good to know.
But, and this is important, regardless of whether you're on your period or not, you always want to be bear aware, especially if you're in their natural habitat.
Absolutely. Better safe than sorry when it comes to bears. Okay, so we've covered some of the science and debunked some common myths. But I think it's time we talk about the elephant in the room, or I guess the taboo in the room.
You mean the cultural baggage that surrounds periods?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation that we need to have more openly.
Right. I mean, it's a completely natural biological process, but for some reason it's been shrouded in stigma and shame for, well, forever.
It's unfortunate, and it has real-world consequences, too, especially when we talk about things like period poverty.
Exactly. I mean, it breaks my heart to think that something as essential as managing your period is a struggle for so many people around the world.
It's a global issue. Millions and millions of people don't have access to basic period products, and a lot of them don't even have proper hygiene facilities.
It's heartbreaking,
Yeah.
and it really highlights just how much inequality exists in the world.
It does, and it's not just a matter of access to products, although that's a huge part of it. In many cultures, menstruation is still considered taboo, and that leads to all sorts of problems. Misinformation, shame, girls missing school because they don't have what they need.
It's 2024. It's crazy to me that this is still an issue. We have to do better.
We do. We need to break the silence surrounding menstruation, have open and honest conversations, and make sure everyone has access to the resources they need.
Right. It's about more than just providing pads and tampons, although that's obviously crucial. It's also about education, about changing the narrative around periods, and about challenging those deeply ingrained cultural taboos.
Absolutely. Imagine a world where we could talk about our periods as easily as we talk about any other bodily function. No shame, no embarrassment. And what's fascinating is that in some cultures, this is already happening.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
Well, take the Ojibwe, for example. They're an indigenous group in North America, and they actually view menstruation as a time of heightened spiritual power. They believe that women on their periods have a stronger connection to the spirit world.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
It's incredible how different that is from the way we often view it in Western cultures.
It really is. It shows just how diverse cultural perspectives on menstruation can be. In some cultures, it's seen as a source of power, while in others, it's a source of shame.
It's incredible to me how much our cultural background shapes our understanding of something as universal as menstruation. But I think it's time we shift gears for a bit from the cultural to the practical. We talked a bit about period poverty earlier, but I'm curious about the products themselves. Before we had modern pads and tampons, what did people use?
Ooh, that is a fascinating question. And you might be surprised to learn that women in ancient Rome actually used wool for menstrual protection.
Whoa, seriously?
Yeah.
That's both impressive and, well, I imagine a little bit itchy.
Right. Talk about making do with what you have. And in other parts of the world, women use things like rolled up grasses, almost like a DIY tampon, and even ferns.
Wow, ferns. I never would have thought of that.
It's incredible, isn't it? It really makes you appreciate the ingenuity and the resilience of women throughout history. They found ways to manage their periods with whatever they had available.
It really puts our modern options into perspective.
For sure. I mean, today we have so many choices. Disposable pads, tampons, reusable cloth pads, menstrual cups, period underwear, even hormonal birth control that can regulate or stop periods altogether.
It can definitely feel overwhelming at times trying to figure out what's best.
It definitely can be a lot to navigate. Ultimately, it comes down to what works best for your individual body, your flow, and your lifestyle. Some people prefer the convenience of disposable products, while others prioritize reusables because environmental concerns. And then, of course, some people choose to go the hormonal route, which is a whole other conversation.
Right. It's incredible how far we've come in terms of menstrual health and the options that are out there. But, as we talked about earlier, it's important to remember that access to these options isn't universal.
Absolutely. Period poverty is a major barrier for millions of people, and we still have a long way to go in terms of achieving true menstrual equity.
We can't forget about those who are still fighting for access to the most basic menstrual hygiene needs.
Exactly. And while we're on the topic of important information, I think it's crucial that we take a moment to talk about toxic shock syndrome.
Yes, definitely. It's something I think a lot of people don't know enough about. It's rare, but it can be really serious, and it's important to be aware of the risks.
Exactly. Toxic shock syndrome, or TSS as it's often called, is a bacterial infection that can happen when a tampon is left in for too long. So it's really important to change your tampon regularly. Every 4 to 8 hours is the general recommendation, and to always use the lowest absorbency you need.
And to know the symptoms. High fever, vomiting, diarrhea, dizziness, and a rash that kind of looks like a sunburn. Those are all red flags.
Yes, and if you experience any of those symptoms, especially if you're using a tampon, remove it immediately and get medical attention right away.
Absolutely. Early detection is key. And while we're on the subject of things that can impact our health, I want to get your take on something that I've seen more and more people talking about: ingredient transparency in period products.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up.
It seems like it's about time, don't you think?
I completely agree. I mean, these products come into contact with such a sensitive part of our bodies, but there's still a lot we don't know about what's in them.
Right. It feels like we have the right to know.
Exactly. And while the FDA does regulate tampons as medical devices, there are still a lot of loopholes when it comes to ingredient transparency.
So it really is up to us, the consumers, to do our research, ask questions, and choose products from companies that align with our values.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to our health.
It really makes you realize how important it is to be your own advocate, especially when it comes to our health.
100%. We can't just assume that Someone else is looking out for our best interests. We have to be proactive about our own menstrual health, ask questions, do our research, and don't be afraid to speak up if something doesn't feel right.
And on a larger scale, keep pushing for better access to information, for affordable products, for healthcare providers who actually listen and take our concerns seriously.
Yes, we have to keep these conversations going.
And maybe, just maybe, we can finally shatter those outdated taboos once and for all, right? I mean, menstruation is normal. It's healthy. It's a natural part of life for millions of people, and it's time we started treating it that way.
Absolutely. No more whispering about it in the corner, no more shame. It's time for a new narrative.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I thought I knew a thing or two about this topic, but you've shown me how much I still have to learn.
It's a constant journey of discovery, isn't it?
It really is. From the complex biology to the cultural perspectives, the history, the myths, the realities. It's amazing how much there is to unpack when it comes to something we often take for granted.
It's true. And what we've covered today really is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more out there, fascinating research being done, diverse cultural practices, and of course, millions of individual experiences.
That's what I love about these deep dives. They always leave me with more questions than answers, which I guess is the whole point.
Exactly. It's not about having all the answers. It's about sparking curiosity, encouraging people to question what they think they know and to keep exploring.
Well, you've definitely done that for me today. Now, before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder as they continue their own exploration of this topic?
I think it would be incredibly powerful if we could, as a society, find a way to reframe menstruation. What if, instead of seeing it as something to be hidden or ashamed of, we embraced it as a time for introspection, for self-care, for connecting with our bodies in a deeper way?
I love that.
What if we recognized and celebrated the unique strengths and insights that come with being someone who menstruates?
Now that is something to think about. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. I've learned so much, and I know our listeners have too.
But the pleasure was all mine. Thanks for having me.